Welcome to the Modernize or Die podcast, Conference Edition. In this podcast, we spotlight upcoming Cold Fusion conferences and talk to organizers, workshop trainers, and speakers to uncover all the information you and your company needs to decide what conferences and workshops to attend and what sessions you need to see. Welcome back to another Modernize or Die podcast, the CFML Conference Edition, and this time we're talking about Into the Box 2022, and we have one of our workshop trainers, Dan Card. So you want to tell us, what is your workshop called for a start?
So the actual title of the workshop is Legacy Code Conversion to the Modern World. The idea is basically we've all written code. We've all written code. We all wrote what we would now call legacy code. And how do we actually go back and look at this code that could be written in pure script? It could be a CFM file with no CFCs at all. It could still be using application.cfm. There's different stages of how code has progressed, especially in the Code Fusion world over the last several years. But how do we actually bring that code up to a modern standard? That's basically what this is about. That's the whole theme.
So who's the audience really for this workshop? It sounds like almost anyone, right?
It actually is almost anyone. Even if you've been doing refactoring for quite a long time, you'll get something out of it. Because we're going to get into actually techniques and maybe more of like the academic side of it, we can do a lot of hands-on, don't worry. But if you are managing a site that may be not as up to date maybe as it could be, this is a great seminar to go through and kind of get the basics. Sometimes it's really interesting. We had a really big conversation on the on the Ordis channel, basically, about different uses of the word. So we had a question of someone saying, hey, the phrase legacy software, it just sounds like you're being derisive and we should use traditional and different words and everything else. And it was an interesting conversation because then it got into the question about, well, why is something called legacy? Why is something called traditional? Like, what are all these things? And really what it came down to is everyone has written code. That code works. Okay. And so sometimes there's actually a trepidation about wanting to touch it and wanting to change it, because if it works, why would you fix it? And there's really no getting around it, though. If something's written quite a while ago, it is legacy code. It's been there for quite a while. It could have been done by somebody before you. It could have been done with technologies and techniques that were popular, but popular 10 or 15 years ago. And the industry in general has moved past that. The question is why? Did it change for change's sake? Or did it change because there actually was a benefit to doing it a new way? And a lot of the techniques that we're going to look at, why those actually became standards. We talk about things like env files or local development environments, using command box or whatever. Why are we doing that? Why are we doing things like CF config? Why are we looking at abstracting variables out? Why are we looking at a separation of concerns? Why are all these things important? Yep. And ultimately, and ultimately what it comes down to is if it doesn't make your code more secure, if it doesn't make your code more readable, if it doesn't make your job better, doesn't make your life easier, then why do it? But we're coming from the point of view, once we talk about that, all these things, they actually do have tangible benefits for you as the developer, you for your company, and just overall state of mind. Making this stuff readable, you can go insane trying to decipher old code. So part of what we want to do is make sure it's readable and understandable.
Yeah, for sure. That's one thing. Like a lot of the Ordis tools are built because we had pain doing it the traditional way. And so we figured out, okay, how can we get around this pain? What can we do, build or just style to basically make our lives easier, make our developer lives easier, make the application, like you said, easy to maintain. And so that sounds like, you're going to be working through that. So what are some of the modules and topics you're going to discuss in the workshop? Obviously, you mentioned a few of them. Can you mention a few more? Yep,
sure. So we're going to look at different techniques. We're going to use command box, but we're going to something called .env. The idea of what is an env file. I had no idea up until a couple of years ago. Everyone kept talking about this, and in Cold Fusion, we haven't used them very much. If you're using more in the Node or JavaScript area, you may be more familiar with them. But basically, it's a way that you can actually get all of the tokens that you use for things like HTTP calls or passwords that sometimes are actually, sometimes people store in their code. Oh, no one will ever see it. It's on the server. Who cares? But when you start getting into things like Git and actually shared resources, those secrets all of a sudden can be checked into a place that could be somewhat public, or at least public to other developers that maybe you don't want them to see. And then who knows where it goes from there. So env files are a way of actually having specific variables for a particular instance. I was looking at something recently where I was looking at some code, and there were literally almost 150 lines of code where the application was trying to figure out where it was. Was it in production? Was it in development? Where was it? And we can actually answer that question with one little line in an env file that says environment equals production. And we got rid of 150 lines of code.
Yeah.
That's one example. Things like pulling out functions into CFCs, abstracting functions, trying to figure out what tools are out there. We talk about things like different tools that are in ForgeBox. For example, QB is one, query builder. And your first reaction, especially as a developer, is, why do I need help doing that? It's just a query, okay? And we write them all the time, you know what I mean? But then you actually see how query builder works, and yeah, it's a query, but you take, something that could be, 20 lines of SQL, and then all the scaffolding that goes around it with all the query params and everything else, and you realize now it's like 8 lines of code, and you only have the pertinent side, and you can read it, and it's much clearer, and it's all written in functional programming. And so in a sense, you have less code, because you can hide the stuff you don't have to worry about, and you have less clutter to look at. You can look at the important stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you can take a lot of the boilerplate out too. Like QB, you can actually have a function that generates the start of your query, and then you just pass it to something where you just add a couple of params where that needs it different than another function. Yeah, QB is awesome. I mean,
QB is pretty amazing. QB and Hyper, the two of them are pretty cool. Now, just to be clear, the techniques we're going to look at are not specifically unique to using Ortus tools. Okay, they are general techniques that have come out of, well, on the one hand, from me doing it for a long time. We're also going to be citing different works and looking at different techniques that are highlighted in, even non cold fusion publications. Obviously, things like Uncle Bob and Martin Fowler and that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Yep. Okay.
I was going to
so
say,
these are going to be standard techniques. They're not unique to cold fusion. They're not unique to Ortus stuff. We may look at how Ortus tools may make it easier, but it's not. You're not locked into using Ortus tools if you don't want to. After all this, these are general concepts, and we will dive in and do some hands-on code.
Okay.
I teach a class, a college class, and part of the project we do is we develop sort of a bookstore over the course of 11, 12 weeks, whatever. But what I've done is I've taken all the features for this bookstore and I've made them in one big long CFM file. And what we're going to do is we're going to slowly pull them out now, and I'm doing it based on real world examples of stuff that I've seen in different clients and customers. I'm running it by a lot of other developers at Ortus to say, hey, is this code believable? You know what I mean? And yes, it is. I've had some pushback to say, no one would ever write it like that. Not even like in a modern way, but in reality, no one would ever write it like that. So we tweaked it to be like, this is actually how a real life scenario. And so it's real, how we actually refactor it from there. And we're going to go throughout the day, we're going to adapt that to be a more modern architecture and a modern technique.
Okay, well, any requirements for taking that? Obviously, you mentioned like the books from like Clean Code and stuff like that, but that's not a requirement, right? So is there anything that they need?
The only thing I actually listed on the description, I said prerequisites: a somewhat working knowledge of CFML is a plus. We're starting off with tag. If you've never looked at the script syntax, that may be a little bit of a jump, but don't let that scare you. Okay. No, there are pretty much no prereqs. If you're interested in stuff that you want to do ahead of time, maybe make a GitHub account if you don't have one. Other than that, show up with your laptop, download Command Box, and come have a good time. This stuff is fun.
Okay, so I'm thinking about taking this workshop. So why should I take this workshop?
Well, take this workshop because of mental health reasons. I mean, part of the reason why we actually want to do this is because we can get so frustrated by code, and the more that we can refactor, the more that your code is actually flexible, the more that it's readable, I really think that the less stress goes into what you're actually doing. Now, we're still going to have stress. You still need to get features out the door. You still know this, but we can focus on the stuff that should be stressful, which is solving the problems, and not focus on the stuff that adds stress, which is getting lost in 200 lines of code, trying to figure out where the core part of this is. And also, one thing you find is actually, as you do this, you realize that there are more interesting and less, not even just more interesting. That sounds like it's kind of like a little byproduct and stuff, but there are better ways. There are always better ways to do things. There's times when I feel like I'm very impressed with myself that I wrote something, and then I talked to Brad and he did the same thing in 2 lines of code that I did in 15 or 20, that somebody else may do that maybe hasn't really been focusing on refactoring, maybe 30 or 40. You can always get it better, but you got to start someplace.
Yep.
And
just as button here though too. Remember, less lines of code doesn't make it actually better sometimes. So sometimes
it makes it worse.
Two unreadable lines of code from Brad or some computer generated thing may be actually worse. Sometimes using good variable names and you separate things out to a function that might take a couple more lines might be better code. And clean code tells you when to evaluate that as well. So.
And that is a very good point, because I think that there not only is diminishing returns, like we're looking for broad strokes in the seminar. We're looking at actually how could we clean this up to make it more readable in a low hanging fruit kind of way. And there's always going to be that. But I agree with you. There's also someone that can pride themselves on, I wrote my entire SaaS application in 1 line of code. Yeah, but you can't read it. We're not looking to do that. We're looking to get rid of the clutter. Make it readable, make it shorter if at all possible. But yeah, there definitely is a point of ridiculousness that we're not even going to come close to, let alone go beyond.
Cool. So what do you want people to be able to walk away from this workshop with?
I think a demystification being, I want to walk away with some of these techniques being demystified. Now, what I mean by that is I know I'm relatively not my path on doing a lot of these techniques. I'm still relatively new at Ortus, but I started doing a lot of this refactoring and really diving into things like functional programming starting about 4 or 5 years ago. And I know before that, my biggest thing was, why are so many people over engineering their stuff? I did it very easily with tags, and I did it very simply with this. Why do we have to get into the blah, 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 blah? And, why do we have to get into all that? And I fought it for a very long time until I hit a point in the code that I was doing. I hit a point where I really couldn't go any further in that direction because I had coded myself into a corner. And what I had to do then is I had to go back and I had to actually start doing this refactoring to kind of figure out, okay, how do I get out of this mess? And what I discovered is that I had built so much tech debt. Everything was complicated. I had hard coded so much stuff into my code that I needed to just not start over again. I don't mean that, but I had to go back and start polishing it up. But I had to kind of restructuring things just to make it be able to move again. But for the longest time, I didn't see the need. And I also, just to be honest, there was a learning curve I didn't want to go through. And so one of the things I want people to come out of this project is, every project is where they are. This is a completely free, no judgment zone. Even if you wrote the code and you look at it now and you're getting lost, you may know it fluently. This is a no judgment zone. That was part of that conversation, is like, is there like an applied negativity to saying legacy code? And we all agreed that pretty much it had to do with tone of voice. So this is a completely judgment-free legacy thing. No one's going to be judging code. The whole point here is how do we make it better from here? And I want to demystify some of the techniques, demystify some of the tools, and demystify some of the concepts, like env files, for example, which for me were a big stumbling block for a long time, because I'm like, why is that?
Cool. Well, it sounds like a great workshop. I think a lot of people are going to learn a lot from it. And obviously, legacy migration or modernizing code is definitely a big request of Ortus, and a lot of clients are asking for help with that. So this might be something that, a lot of people who are looking at doing that modernization can really benefit from. So, well, thanks very much for your time, Daniel. And we're looking forward to your workshop. So again, the workshop is going to be the day before the conference, Into the Box. You can buy your ticket for just the conference, but I recommend getting the conference and the workshop so you can attend a workshop like Dan's. And there's 4 or 5 other workshops as well that we'll be talking about in the next episode. So yeah,
and they all sound fantastic. So
yeah, so that's great. Thanks very much for your time, and have a good one.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We'll see you at Into the Box.
Sounds good.
Show notes for this episode can be found on conference.modernizerdie.io, where you can also subscribe to your favorite podcast player like Spotify or iTunes. We also have a link to YouTube playlist to find more videos just like this. Music from this podcast are used under a royalty-free license from sound.com and bluetreeaudio.com.